does participation and deliberation work? And to answer this question, okay, thank you. To answer this question, I thought that it was needed a meeting, or hopefully more than one meeting, about this topic, about the evaluation of participatory and deliberative processes. My understanding is that there is little practice and reflection on the evaluation. In many cases, the evaluations are undocumented. And let me say which are, to me, the main reasons behind this very little contribution in the field of the evaluation. A first point has to do with the political will. Policymakers are promoting more and more participatory and deliberative processes. At least this was the evidence until the disruption of the COVID-19 pandemic. But the thing that is the thing that to me becomes an obstacle for the evaluation of these processes is that participatory and deliberative processes are still developed within a sort of interregnum, where the definition of political and civic participation should be more understood and problematized. So participatory and deliberative processes are neither considered as conventional political participation, for example, electoral vote, petitions, but they are not considered also as an unconventional form of political participation. So they are neither entirely framed also as forms of civic participation. And to me, this is a main problem, a theoretical problem which has practical implications. And one of the practical implications is that this confusion about what kind of participation is promoted through participatory and deliberative processes may convince policymakers not to invest on the evaluation of these policies. A second point has to do with experimentalism. And this has to do mostly with the way practitioners, but also public officials, have developed participatory and deliberative processes in a sort of shared enthusiasm about participation. And however, this has also meant little effort to embed these processes within the governance system and the bureaucratic machine. Instead, the public debate has been long concentrated on the variety of methods, techniques, how. And this happened out of an orchestrated effort to appreciate their results. And a third point, and the last, is the little scientific examination of the evaluations that have been carried out in this field. And this has impaired the international debate on the framings of the evaluation, the methods adopted, but also the criteria that should guide the application of methods. And it seems like there has been a sort of an implicit agreement among scholars, practitioners, and policymakers to keep the public debate much more on the, let's say, procedural practicalities of these processes, rather than on the substantive contribution that these processes can make to policymaking, so the results, again. And several reasons have been advocated for this. For example, some scholars say that participation is still a very wide concept, and this goes to the first point. I mean, concept means what kind of participation are we talking about? But also the problem of evidence on the evaluation of citizen engagement and participation, which is still scattered and difficult to analyze. So, in my experience, I've had also the opportunity to touch with my hands the difficulties, but also the exciting task of setting out evaluation in this field. And to me, this is a trial and error process. And we have to tolerate often approximative results. But we can be relieved by the fact that all policy evaluations, I don't know if you agree, Paolo, are in most cases an approximation to the truth. Let me share with you this PowerPoint. Yeah. Okay. So let me also locate this seminar within the broader series that have been organized since April 2022. This is a seminar series which is related to the implementation of the first Citizens Assembly in Lisbon, which was officially called Citizens Council, Conselho dos Cidadãos. Sorry, maybe I have to. This was the first deliberative experience organized on a local scale by a city in Portugal, and it held three main goals. The first one was to promote a new space of co-production of proposals for the city. The second goal was to bring citizens closer to the decision making, and the third was to integrate citizens' contribution to improve the effectiveness of decisions taken by the municipal executive. This Citizens Council in Lisbon was launched in January, and the deliberative session took place on the 14th and the 15th of May. It relied on the random and stratified sampling of 50 citizens from a database of 2,351 citizens who signed up voluntarily to participate. The sortition was conducted by an NGO called Fórum dos Cidadãos, Citizens Forum, which has experience in the organization of citizens' assemblies in Portugal. The sortition was based on 5 criteria: gender, date of birth, the urban district of residence, work or study, the professional status, and the educational level. All the primary data that were collected by the City Council were pseudonymized and shared exclusively with the Fórum dos Cidadãos and with the Institute of Social Sciences. The topic for deliberation was climate change, as most of you know, and the facilitation was in charge of a third independent organization called Human Fleet. In fact, the Institute of Social Sciences was contracted as the external organization in charge for the evaluation of this assembly, and I myself was appointed as the coordinator of a team composed of Inês Renda, who is here in the public, she's there, and Camila Costa, who is also here with us in the room. So this seminar series was organized to trigger the debate on citizens' assemblies in Portugal by taking advantage of this first assembly in Lisbon. As you can see from the posters here in this slide, the first meeting focused on the methods of citizens' assembly, and we had John Dryzek and Ernesto Ganuza as keynote speakers. The second meeting focused on climate assemblies, since the main topic of the assembly was climate change, and we had Frank Fischer, Graham Smith, and Luisa Schmidt, who is a scholar here, an in-house scholar of the University of Lisbon. And in this last meeting, we have the pleasure to learn from Stephen Elstab, Jeva Sesnulaitite, Venceslav Korazev, Paolo Riosafeio, and Mita Marra. Before I briefly introduce the speakers, I would like to share some insights from the evaluation of this Citizens' Assembly in Lisbon. So, we were commissioned as a university to deliver an external evaluation of the Citizens' Assembly by the Lisbon City Council. And we chose independently the evaluation criteria and the methods, and we also decided to rely on and adapt the recent OECD guidelines for the evaluation of deliberative processes, which Eva will talk about in some minutes. We applied a mixed methodology to draw insights on the three main phases of this citizens' assembly. The first one is the preparation and planning of this assembly. The second is the deliberation and results. And the third is the pathways to impact. So we applied several methods. The first is the document analysis of all the official documents published by the City Council, including the methodology. The methodology was the basically was the guidelines of how the Citizens' Assembly should work. And also the registration form, since this assembly worked through the previous registration of the citizens who wanted to take part to this assembly. We had several monitoring meetings, including also one follow-up meeting with the so-called ambassadors. Ambassadors are a small group of citizens who participated in this assembly that should follow the implementation of the proposals. We also have a lot of field notes from the observation of the two-day session, two-day deliberative session. We applied pre-post questionnaire surveys with participants and non-participants. So we applied a counterfactual design in this case. I will say something more in the next slide. We also had several on-site interviews, well, actually 3 interviews with with 3 of the 4 experts who were invited at the very beginning of the assembly to share their knowledge about climate change, and also online interviews and focus groups with all the members of the organizing committee of this assembly. Finally, we also analyzed all the news from the media, both news shared by the Lisbon City Council and news from online press. And finally, also, as I said, and last, we also participated to a couple of meetings that were organized by the Lisbon Municipal Assembly. Basically, these were meetings that were proposed by one of the political parties at the opposition of the current executive in Lisbon, which aimed to discuss this new initiative. And so just to share some highlights, really some, only some few actually. So we had 1 sample of 50 participants plus 2 samples of non-participants. Let me clarify this point. So the first sample was composed of citizens who were invited to participate to the Citizens' Assembly. And then we had another sample of 50 people who were selected to be substitutes in case people that were selected in the first sample had some problems to actually take part to the assembly. But we also had a third sample of people who were randomly selected on a stratified basis, who did not receive any formal invitation, neither to be participants nor to be substitutes. And the initial idea was to have this third sample of people who were, let's say, totally unaware about the Citizens' Assembly. I mean, how it should, what people should be involved in this Citizens' Assembly. But actually, in a second, at the second stage, we merged the 2 samples of non-participants. So to make it simple, we have 1 sample of participants and 1 sample of non-participants. So we conducted questionnaires before and after the deliberative session. That's why pre-post, I don't know if you are all familiar with this method. And we applied these questionnaires in place with the participants and online with the non-participants, before and after the session. And this was aimed to draw insights on the evolution of expected changes in the personal attitudes and beliefs of participants in comparison, so to making a comparison between participants and non-participants. And from these, some highlights. As you can see from this slide, the first highlight has to do with the statistically significant increase of external political efficacy, which is the perception of responsiveness and proximity between citizens, elected representatives, and the political system. In contrast, for example, the internal political efficacy, which is the confidence that the individual places in his or her ability and competence to participate politically, remained high but stable, so there was no change. A second highlight has to do with the fact that participants reported significantly higher levels of satisfaction with the functioning of democracy in Portugal and with democratic life in Lisbon after participating to the Citizens' Assembly. And the third highlight has to do with an increase of knowledge on climate change, as shown by some questions that we posed about factual issues related to climate change. And this data confirms that participants were able to learn new information during the session, which is very relevant for this type of exercises. Still, we have some open questions after this evaluation. So, even if in summary the Citizens' Assembly was very well evaluated by both participants and members of the organizing committee, some concerns arise, and it would be very interesting to also discuss these concerns with you today. The first has to do with the information. How much information can be shared on the topic that is selected for a Citizens' Assembly? Participants evaluated very clear and useful the information that was provided by the City Council. However, they had some concerns about the quantity of information. And related to that, our question have to do with the timing when information is provided. So whether information should be provided before the Citizens' Assembly or not, and if it's provided only during the session, whether we should think on different formats. A second issue has to do with the experts, with the role of the experts in these exercises. How can we ensure the most appropriate selection of experts? For example, one of the issues that was discussed internally in the preparation of this assembly was whether we should have experts, let's say, in favor and in favor of climate change sounds weird, but let's say people who believe and people who do not believe in climate changes, to make it simple, or whether we should have only experts that provided, knowledge on one of these positions. And also another issue has to do with the language accessibility. I mean, how should experts talk about these issues? Some participants actually found the language used somehow technical, very technical. Another issue has to do with the degree of inclusiveness, which is related to the type of sortition that is made with citizens. So in the case of Lisbon, the sortition was based on the registration of citizens, and it was on the base of this database that citizens were randomly selected. However, this issue relates to an evidence that we found in Lisbon, which is the rather homogeneous political attitudes of these participants, since they were all, let's say, confident to be able to influence decision making. They had very high internal political efficacy, and they were all supportive of citizen involvement in decision making, which is not really, let's say, the most general attitude in Portugal. So there is a bias here. Also, the role of facilitators. How should facilitator balance between let's say, openness of the dynamics that are proposed, and a more strict orientation of how each stage of this event should work. And a final question has to do with the duration. So the Citizens' Assembly in Lisbon took 2 days. It was a weekend in mid-May, for the 14th and the 15th. However, the question is whether these events should be longer, should take more time. So at the end, 7 sets of proposals were presented to the mayor of Lisbon on different areas, all connected to climate change. One has to do with environmental education, another one has to do with consumption and behavioral change, energy efficiency, housing, public spaces, relationship with the municipality, and also transport and mobility. So at the moment, proposals are being discussed and assessed by the City Council, and as I said, a first follow-up was organized with this group of ambassadors, so this small group of participants in June of this year. So now let me introduce our keynote speakers of today. Stephen Elstab, Stephen Elstab is Director of Research in the Department of Politics at Newcastle University. His main research interests are in the theory and practice of democracy, democratic innovation, public opinion, political communication, civil society, and citizen participation, all viewed through the lens of deliberative democracy. His research is located on the critical intersection between normative political theory and empirical political science. He held several visiting positions and has been an academic fellow at the UK and Scottish parliaments. He is the co-editor of Representation, the Journal of Representative Democracy, as well as author and editor of several international books on deliberative democracy. Thank you, Stephen, for being here today. Ieva Sesnulaitite is currently the founding head of research and learning at Democracy Next, an international non-profit, non-partisan research and action institute. The mission of this institute is to build new institutions for the next democratic paradigm of citizen participation, representation, and deliberation. Between 2019 and 2022, Ieva worked at the OECD, doing research on deliberative processes and institutions. She was co-author of the OECD report Innovative Citizen Participation and New Democratic Institution, Catching the Deliberative Way, and most importantly for us today, she is the author of the OECD Evaluation Guidelines for Representative Deliberative Processes, which was the main inspiration of the evaluation of the Citizens' Assembly in Lisbon. Then Venceslav Korazev is a member of the Competence Center on Participatory and Deliberative Democracy of the European Commission. The center is a tangible contribution to the Commission's priority for European democracy and aims to respond to the increasing demand for capacity to support participatory and deliberative policies at the EU level. The center is advancing innovation at the citizen science policy interface by researching participatory and deliberative methods across different levels of governance. At the EU institutional level, the center helps facilitate these processes in-house with guidance, training, tools, and other resources. Paolo Ariosafeio, who is here with me at the table, I don't know if you can see him, is the director of PlanUp, the Competence Center for Planning, Policy and Foresight in Public Administration, which is a new public institution in Portugal that aims to support the improvement of the public policy cycle in Portugal. By setting the conditions for robust anticipation and planning, design and implementation, monitoring and evaluation of public policies. Among other actions, PlanUp aims to monitor the execution and evaluate the implementation of public policies, planning instruments and their results. And then finally, Mita Marra. Mita will join us in 1 hour, I guess. She's in a conference now, but she will connect as soon as she can. So Mita is Associate Professor of Political Economics at the University of Naples and Visiting Professor of Comparative Public Policy at the George Washington University. She taught at Carleton and Maastricht University, and her current research interests revolve around the evaluation of performance-based governance systems within the public sector, with a focus on the role of the university in innovation ecosystems, which to us is quite interesting because it was a university that made the evaluation of the Citizens' Assembly. She has published extensively on policy evaluation, and she is editor-in-chief of the international peer-reviewed journal Evaluation and Program Planning. She is also board member of the European Evaluation Society and past president of the Italian Evaluation Association. So without further ado, I give the virtual stage to Stephen, who will provide some key inputs on this topic from an academic perspective, I guess. Right, Stephen? Thank you very much. Let me now... this one. Stephen, I guess if you want to share your screen, yeah.
Thanks. Can everyone see my slides and hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Lovely. Thanks so much, Roberto, for inviting me to speak to you today. So I'm going to specifically focus on evaluation of citizens' assemblies. I've been involved in the evaluation of several UK citizens' assemblies. I'm going to draw on this experience, but also the sort of academic research in this area to outline what the academic contribution to evaluation can be. So firstly, I've been asked to sort of like look more at some of the concepts behind evaluation, and one of the key normative theories behind the development of citizens' assemblies is the theory of deliberative democracy. Ultimately, this is a theory about democratic legitimacy in terms of decision making, that if these principles aren't in place when decisions are made, then they're illegitimate, or certainly not as legitimate as they should be. So when making decisions, the discussion that precedes it should be reasoned. We should justify what we want. We should approach that discussion with an open mind, to be willing to listen to the reasons offered by others sincerely. We should be respectful of others, which involves also listening, and it should be inclusive. Everyone should have a say. And the justifications of this is that then it represents a fair process, or that through the discussion, we pull the dispersed information that we have, and therefore we're making more informed decisions, or that actually the decisions are more in line with the common good. Because the reasoning is public, we have to try and justify what we want based upon the common good. If I was to say, let's do this because it's good for me, you're going to remain largely unconvinced. So I have to try and persuade you that it's going to be good for all of us. The key point here is that these concepts have underpinned the development of citizens' assemblies and similar public engagement processes, so they need to be core to the evaluation as well. Similarly, there's a number of problems with political participation in general, which citizens' assemblies have been designed to overcome. So firstly, these are that political participation tends to be demographically skewed. It's, we have the usual suspects who participate frequently, and then others who are excluded. So, it tends to be people like myself, actually, white, male, middle-aged, middle-class people, well-educated, who are more likely to participate. But this means other views, other perspectives are getting excluded, and this is obviously problematic from the deliberative perspective that I've just been outlined. Also, when people participate, they often know very little about an issue because they haven't been rationally incentivized to become informed about the issue. They have little say on influence in the issue, or the issue doesn't influence them particularly. But if asked, people will often give you an opinion, even though they know nothing about it and have spent very little time considering it. And the third sort of problem is that people are often approach political participation with a closed mind. They've already made up their mind, especially though the people who are the usual suspects, the ones who are most passionate and interested in the issue, they often come with an interest and therefore have already decided what they want. So they're not willing to deliberate. They don't want to listen to new information, other people's views. So these, like I said, these problems then are part of what the rationale behind the development of Citizen Assembly. So they need to be embedded into the evaluation as well to see if the Citizen Assembly is helping to address these problems. So what do I mean by a Citizens Assembly? Well, it's a type of process to public engagement that's, it bears resemblance to a legal jury, which we're all more familiar with. And you take a representative or diverse sample of the public. This is usually done through a combination of random and stratified sampling. It's a lottery. Ideally, if it's done well, everyone has an equal chance of being selected. And people are sampled then based upon different demographics, gender, age, race. You can also have different views on the issues, for example. And it's based upon the long-term history of public opinion research. That you don't need to ask everybody what they think in order to understand what the public thinks. So just like with a chef when they're making a soup or a sauce, if you're just trying to decide whether it needs more seasoning, you don't eat the whole pot and go, yeah, actually that did need a bit more salt. If you can tell from one spoonful if it's a reliable sample, and that's what public opinion research relies on as well. They also try and lower the barriers to participation. Again, the aim is to get people who don't normally participate to move beyond the usual suspects. So people are paid for their time, their travel is covered, accommodation is provided, childcare can be provided. If it's an online assembly, all the IT support and training and facilities that are required should be provided. Once assembled, then these assembly members are given balanced information. This is to try and capture different perspectives and views on the issue, usually through a range of different types of witnesses, experts and advocates. The discussions are then facilitated to try and achieve those deliberative norms I mentioned about making sure that they're inclusive, that they're reasoned, that they're respectful. And citizen assemblies then usually result in a set of recommendations, often policy recommendations, that then go to a commissioning body to consider. So as I mentioned then, I've been involved in we've had a number of citizens' assemblies in the UK in recent years, and I've been involved in the evaluation of several of these. So Citizen Assembly on Social Care and Climate Assembly UK, these were both commissioned by the UK Parliament. And then we've had some Scottish Citizens' Assemblies, Citizen Assembly of Scotland kind of looking at the Constitution, the future of Scotland, and then Scotland's Climate Assembly as well. So I'm not really going to talk about the findings in my talk because I've been asked to focus on the process of the evaluation. So that's what I'm going to focus on. But if people want to ask about the findings from these evaluations, then I'm happy to do so in the Q&A. I think Eva's going to cover why evaluate. So I'm only going to touch on this briefly. But I do just want to say something because I do think it's important. Firstly, despite we're seeing an increase in the number of citizens' assemblies, particularly across Europe and particularly on the issue of climate, we're still in the early days of these things. We're still very much learning, and therefore we need an evidence base to what works well, what can be done better, so we can start improving and developing further. We've come a long way in the design of these things, but there's more to be done, and especially in terms of embedding them in political systems effectively, there's a lot more that needs to be done. But also, if citizens' assemblies are going to determine public policy, are going to, have a bearing, then we need to know whether it should, and whether it should is whether it's then being a good process or not. So the evaluation is absolutely crucial to assessing the legitimacy of the process and therefore the basis of trust, whether that be amongst the public or amongst politicians, whether they should be trusting what comes out of this process. Because there's plenty of opportunity for manipulation here. I mean, they are manipulated, highly manipulated spaces, so it's whether that manipulation has good or negative consequences that we're trying to look at. So what do I tend to focus on when I do the evaluation? Well, have this distinction between the internal dimensions and what happens within the assembly. So we've talked about, that people come often without knowing much about topics. And do people learn through the process? Roberta was already talking a bit about that for the Lisbon process. The aim is for these people, the assembly members, to deliberate. Does that happen? How often? What's the quality of that deliberation? Does the learning and deliberation have any bearing on the assembly members' views by the end of the process? And how do these things all feed into how the assembly members reach their recommendations and make decisions? So those are the internal dimensions that I focus on. I also want to look at how the assembly is placed within the political system and the relationships it has with other parts of the political system. So the external dimensions. So I put Parliament here, but it can be government, it can be a local authority, it could be, a public administrator. I guess you're looking at it in general about who is the commissioning authority. But given it's parliaments that usually legislate, it's interesting to see what relationship they have in Parliament, whether the Assembly actually affects policy in any way. What is the broader public opinion around the Assembly? Ultimately, we're still looking at small numbers of people participating in citizen assemblies, 50 to 100, say. So if there's going to be a democratic mandate to enact the recommendations, there has to be public support for it. So what is there public support for assemblies? I'm interested in finding. Ultimately, there's only going to be, the public are only going to know about it if the media cover the assembly. So do the media cover it? To what extent, and what's the nature of the coverage? And actually an aspect that I haven't covered in my evaluations, but with regret I feel like I should have done, is civil society. We see that there's actually groups that try and promote the recommendations of citizens' assemblies. We also see that there's other groups that try and block the recommendations or actually block the instigating of the citizen assembly in the first place. There's groups that campaign for citizens' assemblies. Extinction Rebellion are campaigning for climate assemblies. So looking at the relationship to civil society is something that I haven't done, but like I said, I think it is a useful thing to do, so I'm going to reflect on that as well. Then how to evaluate those things. So I use mixed methods research. I think that's essential. I think it gives us strong elements of triangulation. For those not familiar with that term, the best example is, if it looks like a duck, sounds like a duck, and swims like a duck, it's probably a duck. So if you get different sources of evidence pointing in the right direction, that can strengthen the conclusions that you make. All of these research instruments have their limitations and their weaknesses, and I think by combining them, you can overcome the limitations of only one method alone. So I tend to use surveys, interviews, content analysis, and also observation as well. And I'm going to explain how now. So firstly, in looking at the internal elements, so here we have the internal element that I'll be analysing in the first column, the criteria by which I'm analysing it, which is inspired by, the grounding theory of deliberative democracy, the problems of political participation that citizen assemblies have overcome, and then the best method to evaluate it, or at least the methods that I've used. So firstly, participant recruitment. We want a diversity of people in the assembly. In terms of types of people, but also the views that they have on the issue. So I usually do this through surveying the participants, often usually survey them, at the beginning of the process, but throughout. Also to observe. I mean, one of my favourite bits of attending the citizen assembly is that very first opening meeting when you look. You never see such a diverse group of people in a room as you do in the citizen assembly. It's fantastic to see. Then how the witness is selected. Here we're looking for, again, we want a diversity of views, but we also need, they need to have some credibility to be able to represent those views. So again, ask the participants, what do they think about the experts they had? Were they hearing from the right people? But the witnesses themselves are usually useful to ask about this. Then how was evidence included into the assembly? Was it pertinent? Was it useful? Was it balanced? So again, ask the participants whether they think it was, ask the witnesses whether they think it was, but also observe the evidence sessions and form some opinions myself. The facilitation, again, here is whether it's promoted the norms of deliberation, were the discussions inclusive, was everybody having a say? Were people just saying what they wanted, or were they being encouraged to actually justify what they wanted, and were they being respectful of each other? Again, ask the participants their experience of the discussions, ask the witnesses what they thought. I've done content analysis of the discussion, so you record them, you get a transcript, and then you code them for these deliberative norms, discourse quality index, if some of you are more familiar with some of the different types of research methods. Also observe the sessions. There's some I've actually interviewed the facilitators as well, but to be honest, I haven't found that I've got an enormous amount of insight from that, but it could still be potentially a useful thing to do. And then the final internal element is how does this affect the participants? So do they learn? Does that learning affect their opinions on the issue? Does it affect their behaviour? One of the things I'm looking at with Climate Assembly UK is whether people have changed their sort of, for want of a better word, climate behaviour. You know, are they, you know, how they travel, how they heat their homes, their diet, all of those kind of things. Is it having an effect on their behaviour, not just on their views? You know, we know from public opinion research it can be hard to change people's opinions, but it's even harder to change people's behaviour. And similar to Roberto in his study, we looked at efficacy as well, internal and external. So whether people trust themselves to be able to have a say in the political system, whether they trust the political system to listen to them or not. Moving on to the evaluation of the external element. So Parliament policy, we can take these in one. Ultimately, we wanted to know, do these things have an impact? Now, looking at whether it's actually influenced a policy, that's one thing, but there are other impacts. If you just focus on that you would lose, I still think are important. You know, even if it hasn't made it into policy, has it been debated in Parliament, or you know, is it changing how political elites are discussing these issues? Is it changing the opinion of some MPs, even if it's not changed the actual policy? But yes, we do want to see whether it's changed policy or not. So usually interviews with politicians and civil servants. Again, observation, there can often be, you know, like observing the debates in Parliament, if there are any. Sometimes there's sessions at the end of a citizen assembly that bring assembly members and politicians together. And then content analysis of any Parliament or policy documents as well, to see if, you know, the alignment between policy and assembly recommendations, to see if anything's actually attributed to assembly recommendations. In Scotland, the two citizen assemblies in Scotland, the government produced very long, detailed responses to the citizen assembly recommendations that we were able to analyse as well. So we mentioned before the importance of whether the assembly can take the public with them. Is the public aware of the assembly? If they are aware of it, do they support it? Are they discussing it? Does it affect their opinion? You know, are they being led by it? Again, do this through population surveys. And it's quite useful to do this at different time points just to see whether, you know, it changes through the course of the assembly. So the public primarily will know about the assembly or not know about the assembly via the media. So to what extent does the media report on the assembly, and does that change over time? Is it positive or negative about the assembly? Is it focusing on the issue the assembly is addressing, climate change, for example, or does it mainly talk about the process? What sort of actors are mentioned? Is it focusing on the assembly members, or is it focusing on the politicians or climate activists or other people? And again, this is just a content analysis of the media coverage itself. Then I said the bit that I haven't done, but I would like to in the future and regret not doing it, is civil society. You know, are different groups aware of it? Do they support it? Does it influence their debate and their opinion? And I guess I haven't done this, and part of the reason why is I hadn't expected so much civil society activity around assembly, so I hadn't thought about doing it. And then I think there is a methodological problem about how to get to a good sample, because otherwise it'd be too easy just to get to people who are in favour of it and not people who are critical. But also you want people who are just ambivalent about it as well. You want to capture that. And I think it would be hard to get a reliable sample for that, but not impossible, and we should certainly try. So I just want to finish up with some key lessons then that I think that are really important for any evaluation. Firstly, evaluators have to have good access to the process. If they're not going to be given good access, then it's a non-starter. You have to have access. It should be, the evaluation should be a balance of co-production. I've talked about this thing about the importance of it is for learning and development, and you want to know the people who organise these things and what do they want to know, what do they need help with. You want to make sure the evaluation is fulfilling their needs. But at the same time, you need to make sure that there is some independence there, that the evaluators are unbiased and don't have, too much interest in providing a positive evaluation if it doesn't deserve it. And therefore, there always has to be a methodological rigor to the evaluation to ensure that that's happening. I think it's really important to look at the internal and external dimensions. My research suggests that they affect and influence each other, and you would miss a lot by looking at only one. And so it's important to look at both. But you do need mixed methods. One tool is not going to allow you to really assess the internal and external dimensions that I've just been through. But ideally, that actually analysis should be longitudinal. Quite often, and this is the case in a lot of my work, the evaluation stops when the process stops. And quite often at that point, there doesn't seem to have necessarily been that much policy impact. But I think sometimes these things, policy process is messy, it's complicated, these things can take time. So sometimes I think it is worth looking at the impact over the time. Assembly members, we know a lot about how participating in assembly affects assembly members, but only it tends to stop at the end of the assembly. How does it affect them, further down the line? And similar public and media coverage. Do these things stay in the media? Does the public awareness of them improve over time? Or, these are things that are worth considering. So I don't think longitudinal analysis is essential. It's definitely a strength. And then finally, I've spoken about the evaluations of UK assemblies I've done. Those 4 reports are all available if anybody's interested. But thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stephen. This was wonderful. I don't know if you can hear it. Thank you very much. I have some few questions for you, but I can wait let's wait this lot of Q&A, and if you agree, we can give the stage to the next speaker. Venci, I think it's you. In the I think it's you. So Venci, please tell us a little bit about how we can go beyond the symbolic use of the evaluation. What does the European Commission think about it?
I will not be as brave to claim thinking of on behalf of the entire Commission, but I will try to sum up a couple of points that have been keeping us busy so my presentation will include a couple of points that I hope you will find thought-provoking. Let me try and put it on.
Yeah.
And do please tell me if it works and what you see if I share now.
Yes.
Do you see the title of the slide?
It's, yeah, now we can see everything.
Any
There is something weird in the... Try to go to the next slide, just to...
let's see,
I
because
don't know if it's a
okay.
problem of the computer.
Is it changing?
There's a problem. Try to take the presentation. Ah, no, okay. Now it's okay. I
Now
think
it's
it was-
clear,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, yeah.
No, it was certain Zoom elements
It's
on my
perfect
screen.
now. Thank you.
Okay, so good morning once again, and thank you very much. It's a real privilege to be invited to join you today alongside other distinguished speakers. My name is rather complicated to say, to remember, to write. So I go by Venci, but my full name is anyway Venceslav Kuzarev. I'm a policy analyst at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. And today I'm connecting from Ispra, Italy, where we are based. Unfortunately, I cannot be in person in Lisbon, a city that I like really very much. Currently, and together with colleagues, we're working on a kind of a grand ambition, which is to mainstream citizen engagement into policy across the Commission as an institution. And as of last year, we operate a dedicated competence center on participatory and deliberative democracy, and some of you are familiar with this. And there is a lot of work that has preceded the founding of the competence center, but now we're using the competence center as the focal point for all of our work. Today, I will introduce briefly our work as a competence center, as an important piece of infrastructure in the Joint Research Center in the European Commission. I will talk about our work on evaluation in particular, and on the development of guidelines for doing evaluation of citizen engagement, and when this citizen engagement is specifically addressing policy or science for policy issues. One important aspect that I want to concentrate on is that of evaluation use, and this is why I have this subtitle on going beyond the symbolic use. I will talk a little bit about the different kinds of use of evaluation, and why I feel it is important to consider types of use that go beyond this so-called symbolic use. And also, in doing so, I will touch upon some of the internal considerations that need to be in place to make sure that such evaluations become possible and actually have impact. I mean, they serve the purpose for which they were committed. Let me begin first with a brief introduction to the Competence Center. We have, I could say, two major ambitions, and one I already touched upon. We're working towards the mainstreaming of participatory and deliberative practices across all of the Commission services, and at the same time we support this sort of mainstreaming by providing capacity building to different levels, to the Commission, inside the Commission, but also to other levels of governance. So this is a capacity that needs to spread out. It's not, it cannot stay closed inside a single institution, even in the Commission. We're very committed, in fact, to develop an internal culture and competence that allow colleagues in policy services in a way to not want to start working on any policy problem, on any policy file, without first engaging with citizens from the start, from the elaboration of the policy objectives. And to let me just break it down a little bit, our efforts here are focused on developing internal culture, which also means building on competences, different kinds of competences, and understanding of how these practices can fit within a policymaking process. It's also leading by example on practices so that we can inspire public administrations, including at different levels of governance. So we go beyond also the kind of a narrow framing of the Commission itself. And then also, of course, in a long-term commitment is to better the European Commission regulation, which makes it, this kind of regulation, this kind of decision-making, more fit for purpose. Second ambition concerns the different ways of working across the policy cycle, which, and we say different because citizens can become an integral part of these ways of working, but building upon the mainstreaming. And this is about framing policy problems through co-creation and through co-design, so citizens indeed have a say in how policy problems are being elaborated. Our work also focuses on the production, curation, and circulation of knowledge. And this is knowledge about participatory processes, but also knowledge emerging from such participatory processes. So the implementation of citizen engagement in support of specific policy files becomes a constitutive part, a normal part, a recognizable part, and even a necessary part through the policy cycle. And of course, and not least, part of the different ways of working is also about evaluation, which we see as essentially being about knowing, about critical self-reflection, and about supporting policy uptake, something that I will come back in just a couple of minutes. In the Competence Center, we have 5 pillars, which you can see here on the slide: the guidance, the capacity building, knowledge repository, experimentation, and networking. And I'm saying these things not just to bolster about the Competence Center as such, but because this is an important part of the contextual framing behind our work on evaluation, also within the Commission itself. So on the guidance part, this is about the how. While, of course, we provide also the rationales and the framings and of participation, and ensure that the Commission is up to date on the developments and of the participatory and deliberative forms of governance. So we try to bring this knowledge and to concentrate also on methodologies, build the capacity on understanding and applying those methods within the Commission, and also across institutions and other organizations with a similar remit. On the capacity building, this is in fact the core to our work. We have put together a modular curriculum, and we conduct regularly trainings in-house for colleagues at the Commission on citizen engagement and using participation in policymaking. Recently, we even opened up to external communities. For example, we had a training with regional and local administrators, and then another one which attracted even a global audience coming from even outside Europe, from Africa, Asia, and from different organizations and institutions. And we were actually surprised. We didn't expect that kind of turnout. On the experimentation part, which is characteristic of the work of any kind of competence center within the Commission, we continue with actually doing research and with experimentation innovation in the area of citizen engagement with and in policy. And this doesn't just limit, this is not just limited to methodology development, but also it's about addressing the challenges that citizen engagement presents to institutions like ours. For example, one, what are the enabling conditions to institutionalizing citizen engagement in policy institutions? This is an ongoing debate and a lot of exchange, active exchanges going on between different commission services on this. Our own work on evaluation has a very experimental character as well, in the sense that we do not commit to pre-existing frameworks, but instead look broadly at evaluation theory, at knowledge on participatory processes. We consult a broad range of actors in an effort to weave together the theory and practice and come up with a solution that can be taken up while at the same time also continuing to evolve. And this is precisely the focus of my own work at the JRC. And lastly, this is the networking pillar that we have in the Competence Center, which is, it involves an ever-growing community of practice on citizen engagement. And this community of practice comprises practitioners and practitioner organizations. It includes partner institutions, but also scholars and policy administrators, commission policy officers, and others who share an interest in participation and deliberation. This community of practice facilitates exchanges and provides the space, often a virtual space, but even more so now, and also physical space, where commission services and other members of this community can meet and converse and exchange. Our work on evaluation is in fact one such example of how this community of practice was mobilized. As we had contributors who convened together, and their exchanges served as initial guidance, as inspiration and reflection to our own ambition with doing evaluation. I need to say a couple words on how we frame evaluation, because this is our starting point. And when we started our discussions on the need to conduct evaluation on citizen engagement, we started by looking at program evaluation theory and agreed that this is what will shape our discourse. And one of the major authors in evaluation theory, Carol Weiss, she defines evaluation as a rational enterprise that takes place in a political context and is undertaken to feed into decision making. And then this is a definition that comes from about 50 years ago and still stays unchanged. So for a policy institution, political institution as well, such as the Commission, it demonstrates the importance of evaluation indeed as a rational enterprise, and it is a political context that we need to keep in mind. Evaluation is also a means to encourage learning and its continued policy and organizational running on participatory processes. When we speak also of evaluation, perhaps it's important that to consider that it's not just a general concept. Instead, there is a kind of a meta object of this evaluation, and this is invited engagement. This is not self-driven civic activism that we are trying to develop a framework to evaluate. No, this is only applied to invited engagement that comes at the initiative of a policy institution such as the Commission. So this is an important layer here. At the same time, when we rely on program evaluation theory, or which is the bulk of the evaluation theory anyway, we need to stay cognizant that citizen engagement is not a single program. It's not a program. It's not something that is clearly defined with a clear objective. It is rather an orientation to policymaking. And it's also value-laden and value-driven, and this builds on the values of democracy, on openness, on inclusivity. Because we are at the Joint Research Center, we also have this preference on engagement at the science, policy, and society interface. So it means that we have a tendency to concentrate on issues that emerge with science, with technology, and the relation of society with these emerging trends. So in the end, we have to face a key question, and that key question for our approach to evaluation is how can we make the best use of participation in policy making? This is what underlies the framing of evaluation and our work. Also, another important consideration in this presentation, when I talk about citizen engagement, and not just in this presentation, but pretty much in principle, I refer not to the abstract notion of participation. Instead, I tend to refer to a tangible process through which a participatory experience is lived and realized. So this is a process, the participatory process, the citizen engagement. When I say citizen engagement, I mean this process, which can be planned, which can be managed, observed, and of course it can be evaluated. And this is not purely about doing process evaluation, however. So even though we say this is a participatory process, the evaluation approach doesn't have to be a process evaluation or so looking at temporal dimension. It is possible, it is necessary, but it's not exclusively this, because citizen engagement as a process generates outputs that are or are expected to be translatable into policy. I lost my button. Okay. As I said, we are working on a guidelines document. It was conceived collaboratively, meaning that it involved a number of evaluation and participation practitioners as well as scholars and a couple of policymakers. So we came up with a mixed audience. It proved to be a very potent, very constructive, and very enriching way to bring in different kinds of viewpoints and different kind of advice, and to raise different kind of questions that we are considering and analyzing. But with these guidelines also, we want to, we gave the opportunity to the community, a practitioner community, to start shaping, but we want to promote coherent framing of evaluation of citizen engagement. And this is important for an institution like the Commission. So you go to these guidelines and you know what is meant by evaluating and what evaluation brings in into the policy process, and how evaluation supports the larger ambition of mainstreaming citizen engagement into policy making. So with guidelines, we want to ensure there is a coherent framing, and that it also provides a foundation for a consistent practice of evaluation. It's not just the methods, but also the very thinking about when to commission an evaluation. And those guidelines will, of course, start with primarily addressing the Commission needs. And here I say but. And this but here is important because evaluation cannot stay within the confines of the Commission as an institution. And just like in the tradition of how we commenced, how we conceived these guidelines, I think it's also important that these guidelines be usable outside, so they give inspiration as well to external practitioners, and maybe give inspiring seeds into new practices outside of the Commission. And of course, with such guidelines, we aim to address more broadly the need to purposefully, but also persuasively evaluate participatory processes, which touches upon the problem of use. And anticipating use, actually, as a policy officer or a policy administrator working inside an institution like the Commission, and I suspect also in any kind of a policy administration at any governance level, anticipating use means knowing the scope of possibilities for consideration of evaluation results. And that is already a step towards commissioning more precise evaluations. So we argue that the idea of how the evaluation is going to be used, meaning having its findings incorporated or taken up, is a necessary step when commissioning evaluation, when making a conscious decision about doing evaluation. So by learning to anticipate the use, we argue that such use would be more productive and useful. It's not, doing evaluation, of course, is not an isolated process and it's not an isolated process on many levels. First, it's not isolated from the citizen engagement process that is being evaluated. And here you can see a very simplified and kind of wrongly linear schematic representation. But the point is to make something very clear and obvious. Evaluation is best done not in isolation from the evaluated process. And it is the underlying citizen engagement, actually, that provides the context for the framing and planning of the evaluation. It is an important organizational process that can and must lead to broader learning. So we start with the engagement process as such, to continue with the planning of the evaluation, the conducting, and then the use. But the final outcome, the final or the kind of a part of the final impact as well is the learning, and the learning at the institutional level, maybe at the individual policymaker level, and why not also at the participant level as well. I mean, there are different ways to look at learning, and of course, here, the planning is influenced by the process, by the engagement process itself. We think that evaluations should not be done exclusively ex post, so after the engagement. They need to be planned, if not fully articulated, alongside the planning of the engagement process. So the role of the evaluator becomes also critical in the planning of the engagement. Then the conducting of the evaluation, of course, this is more like an ongoing evaluation process that is part of the engagement itself. So the evaluator is present, the evaluator can ask questions, the evaluator can observe, this, and then this can also feed into future planning processes for future citizen engagements. And then the concept of use. The use is often a kind of a black box, because what is it that, and who is it that is the consumer of the evaluation findings? And of course, use is not just about findings. I'm going to talk about this shortly. But it is about what do you do as a policy as a consumer of the evaluation. So what do you do with the results of the evaluation? How does the evaluation help with the taking up of the results of the citizen engagement? This is an important question we try to tackle. But what is use? And again, here we rely a little bit on, well, actually quite a bit, on program evaluation theory, and which gives this kind of classical definition for use as the way in which an evaluation and its findings lead to impact. And this kind of impact is mostly about the use of the findings of the evaluation, impact on what is being evaluated, as well as on the underlying context, which is mostly about the so-called process use. And use is a peculiar concern for policy and decision makers, because it puts the pressure on them about what to do with the evaluation results, how to take findings and recommendations into the policy process, when to do that, how to do that, in full or just partially, and also on what grounds. And I think I could share a kind of a personal story I have from my own experience, which illustrates a problem of use that we are trying to address. A few years ago, I was a part of that was before I joined the Joint Research Center and the Commission. I was part of a project consortium which was working on technology assessment addressing parliamentarians, which is, the providing of advice on social impacts of science and technology, so that legislators could adapt the regulations that they were drafting, and that legislation could account for a number of anticipated and not so anticipated or desired and undesirable consequences of technology use. And while not strictly evaluation, the stakes were similar with regards to the use of this type of scientific advice. And what I did not see back then was how we as expert analysts were assisting the uptake of our own advice. So we had the advice, and this is how somehow we stopped at providing this advice. But what happened with the uptake of this? What did policymakers or legislators do with this advice? So I spoke with a more experienced colleague, and her response was a bit surprising, because she said, our job ends with the advice. It is the choice of politicians rather than our responsibility, whether they take it up or not. And I wasn't happy with that response back then. Because if we don't care about how the advice is used, then I think something critical is missing. And this is why we believe that the focus on evaluation use is very important. And of course, the context is also quite critical, because context frames the scope of opportunity for use. I already touched upon a little on why we feel that use is important, but let me make a few clarifications. Use of evaluation is not just about why we need evaluation. It's much more about what for in specific terms. The decision to do evaluation is indeed pivotal, but the challenge for use is actually reflected in the results. The answer to the question why lies with what we as a policy actor, in this case, wish to understand about an object of interest that is being evaluated. And in this case, the object of interest is exemplified by a participation process. Use also reflects the value of evaluation itself. And this is kind of a word puzzle here, the value of evaluation. But this is what are evaluations good for. If they can be used to inform policy, then they are good, they have value. But if they're not used or not fully utilized to inform a policy process, then the value becomes questionable, but also where is the value is as well important. Is it with the quality of the evaluation? Is it with the breadth of the results, or is it with the decision of the policymaker how to use this? And then, of course, use is what facilitates policy learning. And here I say about and through citizen engagement processes, because it is not just reflection, it is also direct influence of a citizen engagement process that can deliver new knowledge. Okay, so some of the common types of use. I say we need to go beyond symbolic. And what is beyond symbolic? Most typically, most visibly, this is the so-called instrumental use, which deals with the provision of conclusive evidence in helping to solve a policy problem. And the conclusive evidence becomes a little bit problematic when we talk about participatory processes, because we can probably not build an analytical model that is based on a cause-effect relationship. So we can not prove as easily and not universally what kind of evidence that this participatory process, this participatory experience, what kind of evidence it generates. Is this evidence something that's verifiable evidence? Is it a different kind of evidence? And then the instrumental use of evaluation is, of course, when it serves as the basis for action and for decision making. So what is the follow-up on behalf of the policymaker or decision maker on the evaluation? How evaluation helps instrumentalize a decision. Then there is the conceptual use. And here, this is not only about the findings, it's also about the so-called process use. Because in a conceptual way, when we think of evaluation use in a conceptual way, it's not about proposing solutions to a problem. Rather, it's about expanding the epistemic foundation around, or increasing our own knowledge around concepts and different kinds of propositions, orientations, or even empirical generalizations that help inform policy, and especially over time. Because if evaluations are considered in a longitudinal way, so building upon each other, or in a more of a critical way to learn from multiple evaluations over time, then this helps us also learn about the value of how participatory processes can help alter the ways that we do policy and the customary ways in which we do policy. And then also with the conceptual use, it's an opportunity to acknowledge certain uncertainties, as well as to explore pluralities that emerge through a participatory process. But then getting back to the symbolic use, it is in fact very easy for a political kind of institution to rely on the symbolic use when findings are used largely to legitimize and to sustain existing views or predetermined positions, or be used in a kind of a political quest to endorse some new ones. And I'm not saying that symbolic use is not something that we need to have, or that it's wrong. What I'm trying to say is that is not sufficient, and if we only do evaluation for symbolic purposes, we are missing out a lot. Also, symbolic use tends to be selective. It's focused on persuasion, so trying to use evaluation in a political debate, or to put forward as an argument, but an argument that fits with our preconceived ideas and agendas, and as such, it can enforce confirmation bias. And then, of course, there is the option that is evaluation to be used as a kind of a status action. So we do evaluation because this is the right thing to do and to demonstrate some sort of responsibility. Oops, apologize for this. So how much time do I have left?
Vancy, let's say a couple of minutes if you
Not
can.
more. Okay, so I'm almost at the very end. Here I'm presenting just a few possible examples of use, and I make the distinction between outcomes use and process use. And outcomes use is what the direct outcomes of evaluation. It could be the findings as summarized as a report. But then we see that process use and outcomes use actually converge, because you can use both for example, to create new knowledge, to facilitate organizational learning, this could be derived from both the outcomes and from the process of evaluation. And the process of evaluation is very powerful to be also considered, because it can help alter certain preconceptions and also inspire new ideas. So uncover this kind of new knowledge and also encourage particular ways to expand organizational learning. And then, of course, one of the things that we argue very strongly about with evaluation here is that one of the major types of process findings use is in the enabling and sustaining possibly new policy narratives around participation. So this is kind of a higher level of reflection on the participatory process, because we need, as an institution at least, and as a commission, we need powerful policy narratives that build upon participatory experiences. And then an example of process use is perhaps to encourage internal organizational and functional transformations. And these transformations, which some call impacts, they refer to how the institution works, how the institution integrates the inputs from citizens, and how it acts upon them and how it follows up with them. All of these would be new in comparison to what we currently have in pretty much any kind of policy institution. So as a summary, going beyond the symbolic use implies that evaluation results should inform decisions and fill a knowledge gap, but they need to not only be reflexive, but also constructive. This is about interpreting the experience, building those narratives that I mentioned. And those narratives exemplify the value of participation also in relation to a particular policy problem, which we termed an interpretative function for the evaluation of citizen engagement. Also, evaluation supports, suggests, and inspires action. It's not only about providing answers to hypothetical questions. Action is quite important, and action might mean a range on policy decisions or policy options. At the same time, any evaluation of participation should aspire to benefit a broader range of actors. So, while of course the main frame is defined by the commissioning authority in the mandate, an evaluation could speak up to a much broader audience, and this is what we term the communicative function, because it helps build awareness beyond just the immediate user. And then at the end, with evaluation use, we have to build on findings, but also we need to integrate those findings into new processes. And this is where I conclude, and I thank you for your attention. I'll be interested to hear your reactions. Of course, I'm ready to try answering any questions. And if you have any questions, you can also contact me by email or write to this EU citizen engagement at EC Europa EU email address, which is the main entry point into the Competence Center. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Venci. It was very, it was inspiring, very interesting. Thank you. Again, I have questions, but I will keep my questions for the slot for the Q&A. And Eva, why and how to evaluate citizens' assemblies and deliberative experiences? Please give us your point of view on that. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Checking if you can see my screen well. All is good?
Yeah, thank you.
Perfect. So hello, everyone. My name is Eva Cesnu-Betite. I am at the moment founding head of research and learning at Democracy Next, which is this new institute that works for the new democratic institutions for the next democratic paradigm. But previously, as Roberto has mentioned, I worked at the OECD for 4 years, where I had an opportunity to coordinate the work of developing the evaluation guidelines for representative deliberative processes, also with an advisory group. And actually, Stefan Elstab was one of the advisors, so this is part of his work as well. And so, to begin with, maybe a little bit more context about the OECD work that we have done previously in this area. So we have developed a deliberative democracy toolbox, and the evaluation guidelines is a part of this toolbox. So as you may have had a chance to hear about the Catching the Deliberative Way report, that really sets the trends of the deliberative process that happened to date all over the world. So at the moment, the database contains close to 600 examples of representative deliberative processes. Also developed good practice principles for deliberative processes based off the back of all of this data that we've gathered and analyzed from all over the world. Then, of course, the evaluation guidelines. And finally, we've described 8 ways that we've seen to date that have been used to institutionalize the use of deliberative processes, specifically in the world. I cannot move to... Okay, great. So the idea to develop OECD evaluation guidelines was born because of this trend that we've noticed, that how many of the deliberative processes are happening in the past 10 years. The deliberative way was rising. And so the idea was to really ensure that these processes are not really multiplying and expanding, and we're having more of them and in more different places on different policy issues and on all levels of governance, but also that we ensure their quality and we make sure that we do them robustly, so they can continue to be a useful tool in public decision making. So they build on the OECD good practice principles that are more for the design of these processes, and really operationalize some of those principles to make sure the way they've been implemented, but also go beyond that. They are intended to be minimum evaluation standards to help policymakers, evaluators, practitioners have a conversation. Where do they start conducting an evaluation? Who is going to do it? How to do it? What will be the principles? What could be the different criteria for it? And another aim for this was also to be able to potentially gather comparable data, because if there are more and more evaluations inspired by these guidelines, and if some of the same criteria are applied, and potentially even the evaluation questionnaires that included in these guidelines are applied in different cases, there might be a possibility to really analyze these evaluations and see what are some of the broader trends and what are we learning together as a community by implementing these processes. They're also intended to help increase the uptake of evaluation activities, because this is also something that requires, well, very in-depth understanding, etc., to lower a little bit the bar of the starting point, to really encourage these, especially knowing that a lot of deliberative processes don't have a massive budget, are on a smaller scale. So this is supposed to be a tool to help that. And of course, to encourage the learning from these processes that are happening everywhere, so then we can iterate and develop better deliberative processes in the future. So for the purpose of the evaluation guidelines, the definition, what is the evaluation of representative deliberative processes, we focus on it as a structured and objective assessment of the design, implementation, and results of the representative deliberative processes, be they one-off or institutionalized, and it refers to ex-post evaluation, how it went, and throughout, rather than ex-ante evaluation, whether it should have been done in the first place. And they consist of 3 parts. So the first part is about all the arguments that can be used, why evaluations are important in a specific case, who can evaluate, and how evaluations can be done. Also includes the different principles for evaluation. The second part is really the most content and framework part. So what are we evaluating? framework, criteria, and measurement methods that are available. And the third part just opens a little bit the conversation of going beyond, building on this minimum criteria and talking about a longer term impact. But this is also a conversation that is really just scratching the surface, because this document really focuses on the process of implementing the deliberation. And then in the annexes, we provide 2 evaluation questionnaires. One is for the members of the deliberative process, and one is for the organizers. And they complement one another and suggest and hopefully guide you in the process of implementing evaluation. Well, I think why evaluate? So these are arguments that really resonate with what my colleagues have just been mentioning in both of their presentations. So the key factors is to strengthen the trust of policymakers and the public and everyone else in the recommendations that were developed by the body, to demonstrate that there was a rigorous process, as well to demonstrate the level of quality and neutrality of the process, and create opportunities to learn and make these processes better the next time they're organized, given, of course, that evaluations are actually then used and implemented, as Venceslav was just highlighting to us. We suggest 5 principles of evaluation that can really help ensure that the process is comprehensive and independent. These are independent, transparent, evidence-based, accessible, and constructive. All evaluations should be. So very briefly, what are these principles? So independent means that, especially the longer deliberative processes that last potentially over a half a year, over a year, the evaluations should be implemented by an independent party, if possible. So this could be ensured by ensuring that it's an organization at an arm's length from the commissioning public authority, and so not the same one that's implementing the process. And the evaluations should have no stake in the outcome of the process and have expertise in deliberation. Evaluations should also be transparent, so the way that the evaluators were selected should be clear and transparent and have some sort of criteria. And then the report, of course, should be made available, and potentially aggregated data could also be made available to ensure the transparency of evaluation. They should also be evidence-based on valid and reliable data collected via a variety of methods. Accessible in a way that there should be sufficient resources to implement evaluations, but also opportunity to really access the members of the juries, time planned within a citizens' assembly to actually conduct the surveys so that their response rate is adequate, etc. And constructive, as also Venceslav was talking about constructive evaluations, I totally agree. So they should be constructive in a way to be helpful rather than tearing down the process itself. And so there are different ways, depending on the size of a deliberative process, to really do this. So as I've mentioned, for the longer processes, we recommend independent evaluations. However, for smaller, shorter, more processes that don't have such an elaborate budget, self-reporting by organizers or self-reporting by members by conducting surveys that provided in these guidelines is also a very helpful way to go forward. So we shouldn't really focus on always emphasizing on the ideal way of doing an evaluation, but already doing some kind of an evaluation, even though it's a small process, it's already a very good step forward. Because looking at the OECD data, actually not very many processes have been evaluated to date, so it's not a super common practice. And the star of the evaluation guidelines is really this framework of the 3-step evaluation cycle that we hope is helpful when thinking about an evaluation. So the first step is evaluating process design integrity. So how the deliberative process was set up. Second step is the in-the-room deliberative experience, how it unfolds, what happened. And then the third is after the deliberative process happens, pathways to impact have the conclusions been influential, and was there, the feedback loop was closed? We then develop a little bit more different criteria for each of these steps. So as the process design integrity hopes to evaluate the way that the process was set up, the criteria we suggest to use is whether there was a clear and suitable purpose for a deliberative process, as well as clear and unbiased framing of the question, suitable design in relation to the aim of the question. So was designed the way that it was actually able to carry out the mandate. Was there opportunities for procedural design involvement, say by stakeholders? Is there a clear governance mechanism and transparency of how the process is run and set up and who is in charge? As well as representativeness and inclusiveness, meaning if the group that's randomly selected at the heart of a deliberative process, did everyone really have an equal opportunity to be selected? For the deliberative experience and what it happens in the room and of course outside the room throughout the implementation stage of a deliberative process, it's all about whether the process was neutral and inclusive for all of the different groups, as well as accessible, transparent. The evidence based on which the decisions were made and the deliberation were conducted were broad, diverse, and clear. Whether the facilitation was also was leading to a quality of judgment, whether everybody had equal opportunities to speak, there was not really a domination of different groups, as well as what were the perceived knowledge gains by members, that there was actually a learning happening there, that there was free decision making and response to come up with a final set of recommendations, and of course that the privacy of the members were protected. Pathways to impact is this third step, so it's about influential conclusions. So as I've mentioned, it's about whether there was a response and follow-up, how the conclusions and the recommendations led to what they were intending to be to, and maybe more, and member aftercare, which is what happens to the group after the deliberative process, because lately we've also seen that sometimes after participating in the deliberative process, people feel so empowered and engaged and in a community and active, and then once it ends, they might feel sometimes even depressed or sad or paralyzed. So it's always helpful to keep the community going and find ways to allow these people to further exercise their civic power, as well as stay in the loop of the decisions that are made in relation to the deliberative process that they have participated in. So here I've just selected a few of the elaborations of these criteria that I've just mentioned. So the process design integrity say clear and suitable purpose. So what we're looking into is that the deliberative process was connected to the broader political system or policy-making cycle. For procedural design involvement, whether deliberative democracy experts actually were consulted in the process design. And for representativeness of the process, if everyone had an equal opportunity to be selected, and if the final group of members was broadly representative sample of the general public, etc. For the second stage, some of the examples of the criteria that go further is whether enough consideration was given for marginalized communities to be heard, and whether the information base as a whole was neutral with a breadth of different viewpoints represented. Was there consideration of conflicting values, structural issues, and underlying questions while the deliberation was taking place, as well as if the final recommendations actually represent what the members think rather than what the organizers think, the initiators think, or the facilitators think, or the stakeholders think. And finally, for the influential recommendations, so if they had an opportunity objectively to influence opinions and decisions made by a commissioning body, and if there was enough effort put to actually respond to the members of the deliberative process about their hard work and what happens to those recommendations. In the document, we also describe different measurement methods for evaluation to measure all of these criteria that I've talked about. So we talk about deliberation observation as a method, public survey, member survey, document review, policy analysis, organizer expert witness survey, open-ended interviews, and media coverage review, explaining for which stages of the process these methods are applicable to use and helpful to use, and what kind of results they can provide. And also, as I mentioned, we included 2 questionnaires to gather the data from the members and from the organizers. And then the third part of the document, it's really just opening the discussion, going beyond the minimum criteria. However, because so far has not been very much research around the impact and the longer term and wider effects. However, as we move to more and more deliberative processes being implemented, since we know that now it's been 600 examples, but they're growing every day, and we have all of these institutionalized deliberative processes coming up, really have to also focus on and build on how do we actually evaluate these processes, because they have different considerations. So we just suggest in the document to start this conversation, and so it's about some of the longer term effects that might be the effects on the public, how it empowers the members of the deliberative process, as well as effects it has on public bodies, public officials, parties, civil society actors, etc. However, these usually require longitudinal studies and way more research, and it's quite hard to demonstrate the influence of these ad hoc assemblies. So this is something to discuss in the future. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to answer any questions about the guidelines, and also very happy to hear that you've used them to evaluate the Lisbon's Citizens Council, which is fantastic, and I cannot wait to see the report and the outcomes of your evaluation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yeva. This was very interesting, and we would love to share more information about the evaluation in Lisbon, and let's see. Let's keep in touch. And before I give the I see Mita. She joined us. Hi, Mita. Welcome.
Hello. Hi.
And so maybe I can just briefly introduce Mita and Paolo. So Mita will give us a little bit of a framing of policy evaluation in current times, if I understood. This was your, and then Paolo will help us to understand also how this conversation that we have had this morning can play a role in Portugal in this and how we can eventually also breach more strongly this field of practice which is related to participatory and deliberative processes and public policy making in Portugal. And I do think, this is my personal view, that the evaluation can actually help construct this bridge between these two fields. But without further saying, Mita, please, you have.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to this conference, which I understand is blended. It's half in person, half online. I am here right now in Turin, in the Turin campus of the United Nations, where there is a conference going on national evaluation systems, national evaluation capacities. It began like last, Wednesday, and I gave a presentation indeed in this conference, which has been really a nice environment where people from different parts of the world, different countries, especially from public sector organizations, have come and share their own experiences in building national evaluation capacities. So it's really a nice environment where to share, experiences, facing the challenges of evaluation. And this morning there was a really nice talk among the evaluation directors of different UN agencies about the current crisis, or the different crises we are facing. First of all, the COVID crisis. And my talk is going to be quite brief and just, sort of a reflection. Sorry, my glasses just got broken in this environment, but I would like to share, the screen, but I have no power to do it because, the organizer should...
Let me give you the power.
Okay, thank you. No, not yet. If I can't...
Now you have the power.
Thank you so much. I still have to understand whether I'm able to do. I was given the power, but the problem is how to. So probably I can share it. I don't know. Oh,
you have the function sharing screen at the bottom of this Zoom.
Yeah, that's
window.
what I did, but it doesn't get avanced. Let me just. No, I don't understand. Okay, I will talk, and I can share in the presentation online and just send it to you in chat so that you can. But I can't. Well, it seems to me that I can't share it online either. I don't understand. Okay, I will start about.
Sorry, Nita. Do you want to send the presentation by email, maybe, or to me, and then I try to...
Okay, I'm going to send it to you right now by email, but it will take, I don't know, a few minutes for you to receive it. Anyway, I'm going to do it right now while I'm starting, talking about what I have in mind to share. Okay, so I just sent it to you. So my talk is going to be about, at least 4 points. First of all, the understanding that during, the phases of institutionalization of evaluation, we have observed mechanisms at play which are at cross purpose sometimes. And that was to some extent an unintended consequence. We need to see whether we can solve this situation, because some of these mechanisms are not so in line with our expectations and with the desired results that we would like to see when we introduce evaluation in our public sector organizations. Some commentators, for example, in my session, just made the point that problem, these unintended consequences, could be the results of the price that we have to pay to get evaluation accepted in our institutions. I would say that it's more a problem of how we design, how we deal with constitutive elements of evaluation, and we need to constantly reflect upon these elements. What I'm referring to is that sometimes, I don't know whether you have received, okay, finally, it's better now. Yeah, I was just talking about these mechanisms at cross purpose that are in our systems, and that could be an unintended consequence. Another issue I'm going to touch briefly is the sort of of dilemma that we have to manage between experimentation with some new methods, designs, even organizational type of configuration, and the regulation that we need to pass, that we need to enact, because we are dealing with the institutionalization of evaluation. So we need some laws and bylaws and with some sort of a binding power. So we need to understand how to play and to find a balance between regulation and experimentation. Another issue that I want to touch is the challenges that additional challenges that we face in the current era of populist politics, where we also observe new transformations of the evaluation and the policy analysis fields. And finally, I'm just questioning my own assumptions and trying to find a way to innovate the field of evaluation. Briefly, I'm going to involve you as well into this sort of reflective exercise. Can you go? So the mechanisms at first purpose are those which are indeed in place when we institutionalize evaluation as a mandatory function within the executive and the legislative branch of our institutional system. But instead of getting in place, sort of outcome or a culture that is in line with what we would like to see in our context, for example, evaluative thinking or policy learning, what we have observed thus far is an increasing reaction of different stakeholders to evaluation, which is quite undesirable, like fear of punishment or shirking or some sort of manipulation of information to avoid any sort of consequence, legal consequence, that especially managers face, or a mentality that is very much in line with bureaucratic compliance, resistance sometimes to the evaluative information, or even contestation. For example, in the university field, there's been a lot of resistance from researchers to get evaluating just on the basis of their publications, and so they have resisted to these systems, which is quite hierarchical and top-down, in the sense that it's not been designed to introduce any participatory type of insights from the ground. So is it something that we could expect when we had already designed our evaluation function? To some extent, yes. It's not a total novelty. Behavioral sciences and the institutional analysis have already pointed out that all human beings hold biases when they receive information, especially information that can be perceived as challenging. So this is not new to some extent, and now we need to be even more aware that the same experts, the same evaluators may actually show their own biases. Even experts fail in this sense. So we have to understand that out there, many different rationalities are in action, limited rationalities, not full-blown rationalities, and we have to come to terms with this diversity and the very, unpredictable reaction that different stakeholders can have when they receive our own evaluative information. The whole issue that was discussed at that point was, do we need to better communicate them with managers, with policymakers, with commissioners, investors, beneficiaries, as if the problem is just the channels we use to communicate. For example, we write too many reports, and reports now are difficult to be digested. Or the style that we use, we need to be more, let's say, social media oriented, and we have to develop, more user-friendly type of language. But this is not just, this is not the only problem. Of course, we need to improve on the communication side, but it's not the only problem to face. Go ahead, please. So as I was saying, we have to be quite creative in the way we try to pursue innovation in this field. But we also have to be aware that we face this sort of dilemma I was talking about just a minute ago. To what extent we want to experiment with new methods, new designs, new ways to engage a dialogue with different stakeholders, but also to assure that regulation is there, even to protect and safeguard, our own independence. And with this dilemma, you can approach and even understand from, different perspective, from the supply side, from our side of evaluators. Of course, we need laws and bylaws that require some binding powers. In our civil law countries, we need a law for any sort of action that we want to undertake, especially in the public sector. But immediately after, we know that when we develop that kind of approach, there is the risk for compliance mentality to be reinforced. And so probably nudging or soft power measures could be also an option to increase the influence of evaluation. For example, solutions like sunset legislation that, laws that already incorporate an evaluation mechanisms could be a solution, a way to make our stakeholders aware that evaluation will come at a certain time to take stock of what has happened on the ground. There is also the possibility to organize, the evaluation function, the evaluation unit within organization in such a way that it is recognized the mission to identify, shortcomings through critical thinking. There are experiments like red teaming just across different organizations that have that kind of objective, trying to be recognized by the other members of the organization that you have by mandate the mission to question whatever program or intervention the organization is undertaking. The same could be for a specific profile that you can introduce within an organization, like the devil's advocate. But this could be an option from the supply side that you can even enrich with further solutions that you may want to experiment with. On the demand side, we are facing quite a paradox here, because there is an increasing demand for evidence, and that the evidence-informed policy-making movement has sustained thus far. So the desire is there to tie decision-making to any kind of fact-based information, evidence of any kind, to improve the policy itself. There is also an increasing interest from investors and decision makers in social impact assessment, both from the private and the public sector. More and more there are instances of programs that use the scheme of pay for success. So investors are going to disburse funds when they receive evidence of results already achieved on the ground. So this is something that, again, seeks to build evaluation within policies and within organizations. Another, for example, important factor is the increasing availability of environmental and socioeconomic and governance indicators, the ESG, are trying to drive social responsible investments, but this actually demonstrates the need to integrate different metrics and to understand impact from different perspectives, from the environmental perspective, the socioeconomic perspective, and most importantly, from the governance perspective as well. So there is a demand for evaluation relying on diverse metrics, to be able to account for impact in a more meaningful and more accurate way. But at the same time, we face these new challenges in politics and in policy analysis and evaluation. The post-truth phenomena, for example, the very fact that we are now dealing with major propaganda or alternative facts, and the fact that the political climate is such that you observe so much polarization of positions in the political arena. Then you have new and old crises, the climate change and the pandemic, but the never-ending poverty and war. For example, this morning we were talking about evaluating in crisis, when there are multiple crises, going on, and evaluating the response to crisis. For example, the response to COVID-19 emergence. These are new challenges for evaluators out there, especially international organizations, but even national evaluation systems need to understand how they function, how they work in such new situations. And again, you have the multi-actor stakeholder participation, and you have to deal with many different social groups participating in the evaluation, participating in the program implementation, and the programs themselves become more complex. And that's something that we know, how we address, for example, European structural fund programs, which have multiple objectives, multi-site, multi-sector type of interventions, and therefore complex theories of change that need to get explored on the ground. While we are, and I was already anticipating this issue, faced with new type of evidence that we have to integrate in our studies like scientific evidence, but also evaluative findings and expert judgment, user experience, organizational know-how, citizen science, social media, the big data. For example, in an evaluation that I've been involved recently of social impact of a museum in my city, we were able to rely on a platform which is integrating data from different sources, very heterogeneous data from sensors, from buildings, the level of heating, the temperature, or the level of traffic, or how many people pass through a specific street where many museums in my city are located. These are all different type of data that we need to be able to integrate in our studies. And therefore, there is need for interpretation, intelligence. And with big data thus far, we haven't seen much of this intelligence in digging out from these large databases new meaningful findings and recommendations. Go on. So, my very last points, questioning my own assumptions as well. For example, if we really want to innovate in this field, how can we propose other evaluators and our stakeholders and clients? How can we engage a dialogue in order to experiment? First of all, with our fellows evaluators in the evaluation community. I guess, there's need for much peer review, exchange of ideas. A few hints actually can be suggested by the work of very well-known scholar and social scientist Hirschman, that has worked a lot in development. So the kind of points that I propose to you are based on my effort to make these arguments more convincing, not only from the evaluation perspective, but also for the purpose of enhancing development and growth and advancement of our societies. So I was saying, let's allow for self-evaluation and peer review, drawing on Hirschman's notion of giving latitude and space, for example, for unintended consequences to be explored, and even to understand how serendipity happens. This means that when we build national capacities, national systems, we aim for framework legislation, not just very specific and delimited type of legislation that could be perceived as too, let's say, macro-managing, the work of evaluation units or evaluation organizations. When we think about evaluation systems, we have to allow for these systems to connect systematically to counteract this sort of silos culture. For example, in Italy, but I've heard also here, every evaluation system is standing on its own, separate from the other evaluation institutions, organizations, and the practices that are developing within organizations and in the social context where they operate. So the suggestion here is to really increase the connections across systems, across evaluation systems, trying to identify the backward and the forward linkages, Hirschman would say. Another reflection that I would like to propose to this audience is thinking deeply on the positionality of the evaluator vis-a-vis the other stakeholders, especially if we consider that in complex programs we are confronted with emergent results or the embeddedness of some of the transformation processes, which basically imply that we do not have to necessarily follow bottom-up processes of evaluation nor top-down processes of evaluation, but we need to be aware that change can be nested in some niches of our systems or our context, and we have to abandon the idea that we have to necessarily follow, these traditional approaches like top-down or bottom-up, and we have to question our own assumptions. Hirschman would say we need to become aware of the obstacles in the perceptions that we have and we hold, even unconsciously, that prevent us from seeing transformation occurring in the context. So, again, this means playing with different evaluative designs, techniques, methods, unleashing creativity, and even trespassing, the traditional approaches, the disciplinary boundaries that usually orient us. For example, if I am an economist, I'm trying to just look at the costs and benefits, and I will leave the sociological, analysis to the sociologists or to the statisticians. But again, these sorts of very, discipline-based type of practices are not adequate to face the current complexity of programs and contexts. So again, we have to find ways to integrate and develop multidisciplinary type of approaches to design evaluation studies which are meaningful and adequate to the challenge.
Yeah.
And the very last 2 points. Yeah. This means, of course, questioning our metrics and indicators, and last but not least, focusing not just on the evaluation findings, but much more on the use of evaluation findings. This implies a political role to play in the different arenas where we operate, and this means really having in mind a sort of political function, a democratic function that the evaluator may play or wants to play in the context where he or she operates. Hirschman would say a reform-mongering role, meaning that the evaluators is then engaged with the other actors to pursue social betterment and a democratic function that allows all voices to be heard and to be represented at the table. And that's I finish here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mita. Thank you very much. You actually touched upon several points that were raised today by the other keynotes. One of the last one is about the use of the evaluation results. And I give the stage to Paolo. Sorry for there is a little delay, and you can come here, and open the presentation.
Enquanto o Roberto prepara, aproveito para cumprimentar todos os que estão na sala, em português, por um momento. Para dizer que é um prazer para mim estar aqui, partilhar convosco algumas ideias. Antes mesmo de passar para o inglês. So I'll start by thanking Roberto and ICS for the invitation to take part of this seminar. It's for me a great pleasure and also an opportunity to learn not only from the specific experience of the civic engagement in Lisbon, the work that has been presented today, but also from the knowledge, the experience of our international colleagues who bring to us very, very relevant insights on this issue. I'm not sure of being able to answer the questions that Roberto made to me, but I have to say that I'm not going to talk about evaluation, but to talk about many other things. Some of them, I think, those are relevant to the issue we have here. I have to say also that my standing point is to say that I came from the public service. So we are here among researchers, scientists, but I'm not in this position. I came from the public service. I work for the government, so that's it's important to underline this the specific issue. And I have to say as well that one of the big challenges, if I have to choose a big challenge on this very relevant topic that we are discussing today, I would choose the following. We have to bring together different stakeholders, not forgetting those who are in charge with public policies. That's the big challenge. So I think me and my colleagues of PlanUp, we are the few in the room, and we have that kind of responsibility to make the connection between those who are studying, trying to learn from experience, and those who are practicing the policies. And this is not an easy task, and that's why I would choose it as a theme for our conversation. So I'll start with some not new ideas. So, but to make the point that we have to have a common understanding where we are in those. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Okay. So I think that we can agree on those general ideas that in democratic countries, trust is an important indicator to measure how people perceive the quality of government institutions, how they perceive the public policies, how they associate with the public institutions in the delivering of those goals, and also that public trust services as an input to governance. We need to measure and to have a clear idea on how the whole society trusts in the decisions that the governments are putting in practice. This is a very relevant issue to help or to hinder the implementation of in general terms, the policies. But that public trust may
as well be an important outcome of governance. So it's not only an input to our understanding of how things must be being done, but also as a result of the ways that governments are working and the systems of governance are working as well. So trust as an expression of how people perceive their public institutions work. So the concept of political efficacy that has been brought for many of our interveners today, that refers to that feeling of how individuals perceive their political action and how the impact they have in decisions that are made by the authorities or any kind of levels of decision making, being internal, external. I'm not to discuss the concepts, but the idea that external efficacy is that capacity of each one of us can perceive how profound our say is accepted, is considered by the political powers, is a very relevant indicator how is the level of satisfaction with the functioning of our systems, our democratic systems. So what we can observe from very different studies that has been made mainly in the last decade show there is a very strong correlation between external efficacy, so that kind of perception that the society as a whole has his voice is understood and taken in consideration, and its satisfaction with democracy. So what we are talking about is about democracy. It's not about evaluation of specific policy fields. We are talking about the functioning of our democratic systems. So I will bring to this discussion some evidence, recent evidence, and some questions. Much more questions than answers. That's my point and my problem. The first of all is that one of the multiple results of a recent survey put in place by OECD by the end of last year, published in the spring of this year. And what I bring today this table, which reflects that in general, and putting apart the outliers of Korea and Japan, both outliers are in the positive way, in the negative way, which is very interesting. And but putting apart those two outliers, what this table and the data that we have on this field reflects is that in most countries has that a kind of similar status on responding that question, how people think that national policies adapt to their own views, to the public views in general. And as you can see, the level is quite similar, taking apart those outliers, and I would say quite disturbing. So people are in a position of distrust with public policies in general. It's mostly 35 to 40% of the people says that yes, their views are considered, but likely equal percentage of them seems the contrary. So we have a very disturbing situation which is in a way contradictory way of that other evidence that we have from the same study. What we can see here, this is for Portugal specifically. Again, not very different from the average of the OECD countries that were in this study, about 20 countries. But what we can see here, there is the level of mistrust is quite relevant in what we can call the political system. So you can see the political parties, the parliaments, the national government, and much less the regional and the local authorities. But the core of the political system, so political parties, the parliament, and the government, are the most fragile elements of this scenario. But where is the paradox? Well, the paradox is if we see the outcomes of their work, the government and the parliament and the political parties, they are doing something in the society. What kind of things? They choose the ways to respond to the problems. They choose the public policies. And how the citizens saw that kind of outcomes. They saw it in a very different way. So they say, yes, in the security field, we feel comfortable. And it's not here, but it could be. And we see in the health system, in the education system. So the outcomes of the political system, they are much more positively qualified that table could express. So the question here is why is this working like that? So we are in the way criticizing, mistrusting the forms, the ways that things are going, but at the same time we are valuing quite differently the outcomes, the results of that work. So there is something here very strange that we have to understand much more in detail. So I have not the answer for this question yet, but we have to work on this in a very deft way. So our goal is to work on this field, to become more conscious, more aware of those kind of problems, and to try to have some answers to those very difficult questions. Of course, we have to deal with evidence, with information as resources for good policies. This is what I call here the more traditional way of looking at it. So yes, of course, we have to have more evidence-based, more information-based policies. But this is not the only question we are facing now, because we have to understand much better the ways that the political system is working and the challenges that it is facing for the moment. We heard from the previous interventions, very interesting ones, but one thing that I didn't heard that I would like to call your attention to is the question of time. We are talking about long processes of learning, of studying, but take a look at the newspapers of yesterday, and you can see that one of the big problems of the political system today, that there is no time to learn, no time to evaluate, no time to decide correctly. So these are the I would say, the typical questions that we have to face to bring together some of our perspectives of the issue. So, of course, that we have to improve when we talk about evidence and when we talk about information. And one way of improvement is to have a much more large understanding of what we call data, evidence, information. We are not talking just of the classical empirical data that we obtain for policies, statistical data, and many other. But we are talking about citizens' attitudes, perceptions, expectations, interests. So that is also on our days a major resource for the policy development in all fields of intervention. So here we have something to discuss when we talk about public engagement as well in this domain. So the question of the session, what does it make the difference? Yes, and I have to say that we have to understood the general feelings in our societies. Do people want to be heard in all the domains? Once again, I'm going to show some evidence of our survey, and that's our own survey, because we take profit of the survey of the OECD to put inside some other questions and to try to enlarge and to go deep on the questioning of some of the issues. And I think some of them are very interesting for our own interests today. And this is what I would like to show to you. This is not, we have not results for the whole OECD countries, but only for Portugal. And the question was very interesting. The question is how, sorry, I have to put the question correctly. The question was, do you think the government should hear more the citizens on that different topics of the policy fields? And what we expected putting this question is, of course, we have some differences, but the difference should be not so large. So in general, if someone asked me, I would say, yes, of course, in every domain of our common life, in education, as well in security, as well in peace and war, as well in economic development, as well as what we want. But as you can see here, there is a very different perception of the necessity, of the need to hear from the public, from citizens. So if you take what we can call the social domains, so the fields where people in general are more familiar with, so social inequalities, family policies, and some others. When we look at some very general issues, very, I would say, common goal issues like climate change, everyone agrees on the general goals on climate change, I would say. Let's not talk about concrete measures to obtain those goals. This is another issue about prices or fuels, about energy, something like those details. So when we talk about general issues like climate change, like sustainable development, again, we have a very large perception that people want to be heard on those questions. But when we look at other very relevant issues, like economic development, like business development, like external competitiveness of our country, even on technological issues, at the digital issues. So things that are at the center of our public policies today, people has a very different understanding of their own participation, their own engagement in that discussion. So this is I would say, a very relevant issue to share with those who are learning, researching on public engagement. Why? Because what I can understand from this exercise is there is a clear relationship on what we call the internal literacy and efficacy, political efficacy. So the feeling that each one of us has in his capacity to understand and to put forward some idea on what to do, and the idea that each one of us has of ours, which should be our own engagement in the process. So this is very relevant when we discuss public engagement in general, I would say. So I would like to not this one. So to close with some reflections on this, to have some time to discuss those or other issues that we want. From our point of view, from my point of view, I think that we have to have some I would say some clear ideas about what we are talking about and what are our own approaches to those issues. And the first one is my conclusion, that we have to have a very systemic approach to those issues of public engagement. I'm not, this is a very complex issue and should be considered as a multi-dimensional, in a multi-dimensional perspective. What I mean by this is that we should have an understanding that convention and unconventional forms of participation, of public engagement, are not alternative ones, but they are complementary. And our democratic systems needs all of them, of those forms. So citizens' assemblies are not an alternative to trade unions, are not an alternative to the engaging with political system. They are not another form of democracy. No, they should be part of our new democracies. Because if you don't understand that the complementary of those forms, I think that we should embrace a very dangerous process, putting a part of the process very relevant forms of participation, of public engagement. They are still very relevant today. So one of I bring back again some original, so where I start. One of the major issues is to taking that systemic approach, which imply to bring together on board to the table of conversation those very different forms of public engagement. And using the word that Mita was talking about in another sense minutes ago, we have to have the capacity to connect again those different forms of participation and civic engagement. And this is what I call the idea of closing the gap of representation and participation. It's not putting them in alternative, it's finding the way of bringing them together, which means the political system and the society as a whole. I would like to finish by saying something about our own work on this domain. What we have, we are a very new service in the public service, which has, Roberto has said it in the beginning, very ambitious mission and very large set of competencies. But I would say that one of our main challenges is to put together those kinds of actors in the society to have much better public policies, which I'm convinced that bringing together those actors, those stakeholders, is a part of the solution to have that outcome. And I would like to finish with those two remarks, those about some ideas of the stages of the policy process. Our main idea that public engagement should be part of the whole development process of public policies, from visioning, from looking at the future, to implementation and evaluation of public policies. We are working on those, on all those domains. And the final word is that we have the duty of innovation, that we have the duty to experiment new forms of doing things. And when I say we, I say the policy makers in general, the politicians, the public services, that has the duty, not only the right, but the duty to experiment new forms of dialogues among different stakeholders, new forms of making the public policy better. And I will finish with one example. What we are trying to put in place is a very experimental initiative, trying to look at some very risky natural resources that we have in Portugal, and putting together conflictual interests, conflictual perspectives, conflictual views of how to deal with those risks. I'm talking about water in particular, and how to negotiate, trying to achieve some compromises, how to do it. Bring together scientists. It's not possible to look at those very technical, very relevant issues without knowledge, scientific knowledge, but putting together other resources of knowledge, like the stakeholders, those who are using the natural resources, those who have interests, in specific interests in the present and in the future to use those resources. And of course, those who are responsible for the policy, the politicians, first of all, and the other policy makers, like the public service. So I'm not sure if this is the right answer to many of those issues or problems, but I think that we have the duty to experiment and seeing if it results or not. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paulo. This was very, very interesting again. I have a lot of questions, but please, if we have 15 minutes, 10 minutes, let's say, for some questions, comments, observations. Yes, one. I think we have a mic somewhere, and it's there.
Thank you very much for the presentations. My name is Manuel Avranches. I work at Planap, and I would like to ask two questions to the speakers. One is a more general question, and the other one is a more specific question. The more general question is, as far as I understand, the evaluations of participatory processes put a great emphasis on the impact of these processes on the participants and on citizens, and sometimes on their communities, the benefits of the processes for the communities. But going back to what a participatory process is, or is expected to be, I understand there is also a very strong expectation on its ability to change the institutions and to change, of course, the relation between the institutions and the participants. Of course, some of you touched upon this issue briefly in your presentations, but it has more to do with the external dimension, possibly, of the process. But I would like to ask you a little bit more on what do you know about the actual capacity of participatory processes to change institutions and power relations and the decision-making process.
Sorry, before you go to the second question, just to confirm, can you listen, are you hearing well? Okay.
Great. The second is a more specific question. It has to do with the relation between citizens' councils and participatory budgets. Portugal is a country where many participatory budgets have been developed, and I would like to ask you, how do you see the relationship between these two initiatives? Are they complementary, or are they somehow the citizens' councils can be an evolution of the participatory budgets? Do the same people participate in both, or is it supposed to attract different people? How do they relate to one another?
Just a clarification, it says citizens' assemblies. It's calling citizen council because in Lisbon it was called council, but it's a citizens' assembly. Is there any other question? Yeah.
Just a quick one. I was wondering how do you explain the fact that from this random selection that you talked about in the beginning, you have very similar ideas from the population for the citizen assembly? That was really struck me as very curious and strange. So if you have any interpretation, okay?
Okay, if there are no more questions, maybe we... okay. Maybe the last one, and then we move.
It is also very, very quick. Thank you so much. And it relates to something that Venti said in his presentation. One of the last points, I think, was how evaluation should support, suggest, and inspire action. But also earlier in the presentation, we had a very clear distinction between having invited participation, invited by the policymakers, and civic action. So when you say it should inspire action, what action exactly are you hoping for? So is it action on behalf of policymakers to kind of integrate the results, and this is something we talked about a lot today, or also maybe hoping for these results to spill out through a media landscape, inspire maybe even civic action, even though we're not evaluating that? Just a little bit more on that, yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Who wants to take the stage first?
Probably I just can follow up on this question because I also have to leave and join the rest of the group here. What type of action we want to inspire? Indeed, there is no rule for, the type. When you think of the results of an evaluation, you think that the use of information can inspire better policy, can actually transform institution workings, can even, incentivize participation from different stakeholders. I would just say that the very use of information for any type of purpose could be, of course, if not used in terms of manipulation or in terms of doing harm, that would be different, you know, the situation. But any sorts of emancipatory or empowerment that can be supported by evaluation would be already a good result. Action means being completely, you know, in the ownership and in the empowerment of what can be done in terms of collective action. And again, with the caveat that no harm has to be done, then any action can be, you know, a very fulfilling type of result coming from evaluation. So there's no rule, there's no standard, there's no, I guess, example to follow, because when, you know, an evaluation is a success and can actually bring about change, anything can happen in terms of, again, empowerment, ownership, and initiative, taking the initiative to achieve and to act upon the type of objectives and values that are shared. You know, this is the basis of democracy. I mean, you want to take action to you know, improve and advance the welfare of your own population. So I wouldn't look for a specific action to take, but, you know, the empowerment and the ownership that you can develop out of the participatory process of evaluation, I think, would be helpful.
Thank you, Mita.
And
Thank you. Bye, Mita.
For the opportunity to be with us, to be with you there. Bye.
And Venci, what do you think about this action?
Well, I think every kind of evaluation should produce advice, let's call it like this, advice, which is actionable. And of course, it depends on the framing of the evaluation, on the range of possible actions that could be taken up afterwards. But for example, if an evaluation is the kind of summative evaluation that leads to a decision whether or not a certain process to be continued or scrapped or discontinued, basically, that would be a different kind of action compared to a broader type of formative evaluation where you would look for actions that lead to improvement to identified gaps. And these gaps could be quite diverse. I mean, I can't possibly list all options for action, but I can imagine a number of such possibilities. And of course I say inspire action as a very minimum, because, well, what you can do with an evaluation report is just, you know, put it on your desk, maybe read it, and that's all. And then refer to it as we have done evaluation on this process, and then nothing. But there is nothing on what did we learn of this? How did we turn this into a knowledge? For example, what we're concerned with at the Competence Center is how to curate this knowledge that comes out of those evaluations. And these evaluations, I assume, will list findings. So these findings would provide grounds for follow-up, some sort of follow-up, and it will be an action. You know, expanding, or for example, changing the way you reach out to citizens, changing the way you communicate out to external actors or to other publics, changing the way that we talk internally within an institution about the possible scope of change to the way we do policy. I mean, all of this constitutes a valid action. I would like to touch upon also on a couple of other questions that were asked. I think the first question was about the actual capacity of participatory processes to change institutions. I think that very much, well, when we talk about citizen engagement, at least in our context, we always say that there are two things that are very important. First is purpose. So why are we doing this kind of engagement? And then the second one is context. How will these results fit? What will they inform? What are they influenced, and so on. So there are these contextual variables that we need to be always aware. So when we talk about the change in the institution, at the most abstract level, that change would be to recognize that citizen engagement provides a valid strand to inform policy. So you get some sort of evidence in the broadest sense from a citizen engagement event or a citizen engagement process, more precisely. And this could be knowledge on how the participants react to something, or it could be recommendations that they are generated, and it very much depends. Is this the final product that the policymaker wants to work with? Is it what the process generated, or this is an intermediary product that's going to be taken up and then maybe discussed at a different level, say with an expert panel, for example, and then it goes back. So because there is this variety of opportunities for citizen engagement processes and methods that implement such processes, the potential to change on an institutional level is in fact quite immense. But I think we need to start with the small steps, and the first is to build the credibility of those processes, and then to start integrating their inputs into how policies are being made. So it's not an open end to what the possible scope of such change is. And then just very briefly on, I'm not sure I heard the question very well. It was about the random selection and how it ends up producing very similar ideas from the population. I'm not sure I heard that well, but nevertheless, I'd like to make a short comment on representativity because it's very common thing that we hear a lot about. And I agree, representativity is a very constitutive element when we talk about citizen assemblies or in more general about deliberative processes. It does come with certain, let's say, peculiarities that we need to be aware of. And one is that this, when we talk about representativity, most often we tend to mean demographic representativity, socio-demographic representativity. And that's at the input. So who comes to participate? And that's the representative panel. And it's a necessity because obviously it aims to correct for the lack of representativity in common democratic processes such as the elections, or inefficiencies in how elections reproduce or come short in representing the population. But what we miss often from this discourse is that whatever is produced during the citizen engagement process is not necessarily epistemically representative of the same population which is socio-demographically represented. So there is no guarantee, and maybe that shouldn't be the point, so I'm just making this as an open question. Maybe there is no, there is no guarantee that whatever the group of citizens delivered in terms of suggestions, recommendations, or whatever it is the outcome of the process in question, will resonate with those whom they are set to represent. And I like to refer to this as an epistemic epistemic representativeness, but it's of course more complicated. So with certain other forms, we don't even need to be as strict with representativity, because say we have 30 people around the table, and those 30 cannot be representative of a population of several million, for example, or even locally. And it is not the socio-demographic variety that we need to represent it. It's the diversity in more general sense. So we have sometimes groups that are typically excluded, or they are marginalized, or they're at a particular disadvantage, and their voices are not commonly in the public discourse. So we need those voices as well, and that might be the purpose. So we will have a different kind of approach there. And
Venci.
I think I covered the three questions I could.
I know that we have a big delay, but I wanted to take advantage of, I don't know if Stefan and Eva wanted to comment on that. I mean, one of the questions was actually the impact that evaluation can have on institutions. So from your experience, do evaluations really make a difference in the way the institutions, political institutions work?
I'm happy to address that. Having done a number of different institutions, I mean, I think in the main they don't. The institution is wanting the evaluation as a kind of rubber stamp to say, look, we've done a good thing here and all was fine. I've always tried to approach the evaluations, more critically than that. Obviously when there's good practice, I'm going to say this is good practice, but when I see things that could be improved, I'm always going to say. And some of those things are smaller scale things to do with the actual process, and others are larger scale things about how the institution itself needs to inform them. And it's those larger scale things that are more likely to be ignored. But at the same time, I think in the right environment, things can change. So like in Scotland in particular, where they've been quite keen on moving towards a more participatory, deliberative democracy, following the two citizens' assemblies they've had there, they're now wanting to sort of have a more permanent use of citizen assemblies rather than the ad hoc. They've drawn inspiration from the two evaluations I've done on that, and they got a team together to produce a report about how they could go about institutionalising and embedding citizen assemblies. Now, that's not progressed as much as I would have hoped, and they're sort of saying, now they don't have the funds to do it at the current time, but maybe in the future we'll see. So it does show that, there's always ideology, there's always interest that can offset these things as well. And I think ultimately any institutional change will be incremental. It can't just come from evaluation either. It needs to have other actors who are, keen to promote and campaign for these things. But still, the evaluation could be part of that. Just very briefly, the second question about citizen councils, assemblies, and participatory budgeting. I mean, for me, they're just different things, and we need, to improve our democracy, we need as many avenues as possible to engage citizens. And so we need PB, we need citizens' councils, citizens' assemblies, but ultimately they do different things. PB, anybody can propose a spending priority, anyone can vote on where the money should be spent, but and that's really it to its advantage, but similarly it doesn't necessarily have the considered views of a representative sample that an assembly can bring. So they bring different things, and we need those and many other democratic innovations to help improve democracy, I think.
Thank you. Eva.
So maybe I pick up on the question that I don't think we discussed the differences between citizen council, assembly, and participatory budgeting. There was a question of what's the difference, right? It wasn't yet addressed.
Yeah.
Okay. The aim of the participatory budgeting model is really to help the government decide how to distribute public funds And participatory budgets can actually happen in many different ways and forms. So sometimes they don't necessarily have any deliberative components to it, and it's more about citizens coming together to propose different projects and then vote on different projects that are proposed either by fellow citizens or by the public authorities. However, participatory budgeting can be done in a deliberative way, where you introduce a stage of learning and deliberation, and then citizens can together actually find the common ground and decide how to prioritize the money that is there to be spent. So I think there is really flexibility there, and participatory budgeting can really be just a form of public consultation, which is more of providing feedback and aggregating individual opinions of different people. But it can also be done in a way where it can actually help bring together a representative group and have a shared common ground recommendations how the money should be spent. So it's a little bit of a spectrum there, I would say, and it's nice to see that oftentimes now we're moving towards the more deliberative ways of implementing participatory budgeting whenever possible.
Yeah, that's a very good point, at least in Portugal, given the context that Manuel referred to, because this is the country with one of the highest rates of participatory budgets, well, at least until the disruption of the COVID. And actually the Citizens' Assembly in Lisbon was the first one in the country. That's why also this series wanted to bring some knowledge about Citizens' Assembly. We don't really know how the evolution and the spread of citizens' assemblies will take place in this country. We know that, for example, in Spain, this is working quite fast, and there are several citizens' assemblies taking place at the local, regional level. In Portugal, for the moment, the first and the only one that took place was in Lisbon. So let's see what the future brings. Let me say a couple of words. One is to answer one of the questions which was very focused on the Lisbon Assembly. One of the issues that we found was that actually there was some homogeneous attitude towards the political institutions and the idea of participation in general. The reason lays on the type of sortition that was made. Because as I tried to say at the beginning, in Lisbon there was a first open call to all citizens to register, and from this registration there was a database of thousands of citizens, and the selection was made on that database, which means that there is a potential bias at the very beginning, a potential self-selection of active citizens or citizens that are more confident to have a voice in the political system. So this is one of the results that we found in the evaluation, which also goes in the direction that was talked this morning. And this was to answer your question. And then a couple of words and then we finish. I know that we are already like 20 minutes delayed. Thank you very much, because this was very important, I think, to bring together, let's say, two different visions on how evaluations can be implemented. It's actually not different visions, but different backgrounds. And what I really wanted to bring today was also these differences and try to build together a bridge between an understanding of citizen engagement in participatory and deliberative processes as political participation, which can be made if we talk about the evaluation of public policies in general and the evaluation of participatory and deliberative processes. So I know that at least these last two contributions from Mita and Paolo try to bring some knowledge about evaluation of public policy making more in general, but it's helpful, to connect these fields of study and practice. And so I think that this was very helpful. I had questions, but I will send you by email my questions maybe. and hope to keep in touch with you all for future meetings and brainstormings on these issues. Thank you very much for your participation, also here in presence in the room, and yeah, I will keep you posted with new events about these topics on participation and deliberation in the future. Thanks again to the keynote speakers, and talk to you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a great day.
Have a good afternoon.
Bye bye. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone. Bye bye.